Fate is predetermined, but our actions change the details. That was a sentiment that was often used in the Magnus Chase book series. But it's a phrase that comes to mind when discussing the Percy Jackson TV show, in this, the first of hopefully several seasons. Hell yeah! The Percy Jackson TV show is not perfect, and it would be asinine to expect it to be, but having gone through the series, I can now confirm that I thought it was actually pretty good. I feel as though I definitely built it up in my mind too much. For the first time in a very long time, I let myself get caught up in the hype, and that actually negatively affected me. Some may question why I was excited for a Disney production these days, and to them I would say Disney is not a single hive mind, it's a conglomerate of thousands of creative minds. So things they make have the potential to be either good or bad. Anyways, it also didn't help that the last TV show I was genuinely excited for was The Last of Us, and you may ask, wait, weren't you excited for the Twisted Metal TV show? No. That series looked like shit in the pre-release. The fact that it ended up being pretty good was a miracle. But The Last of Us hit the ground running in the first episode. It was 90 minutes of some of the most compelling TV I've ever watched. The Percy Jackson TV show, meanwhile, doesn't quite hit the ground running in the same way. For those of you unfamiliar, this season of the show is based on the first book in the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series, The Lightning Thief specifically, where troubled 12-year-old Percy Jackson discovers he's a demigod son of Poseidon and is accused of stealing Zeus's master lightning bolt, which threatens to spark an all-out war between the Olympians. So he needs to find the lightning bolt and prove his innocence before the summer solstice, all while hopefully saving his mother, who's being held by Hades in the underworld. There's much more to the story than that, but that's the gist. You got that? Okay, well let me digress for a moment. The Theseus paradox is a philosophical conundrum that poses the question, if you replace all the individual components of a ship, is it still the same ship? And the other side of this philosophical question is, how many components of a ship can you replace before it ceases to be the original ship? That's the central conundrum that I think adaptations have always run into, because nothing's ever going to translate perfectly. That's a fact. Different mediums have different strengths and weaknesses. To speak on the Percy Jackson movies, some people think that the problems begin and end with the fact that they're poor adaptations, but that's not the case. In fact, I'm going to throw the movies a bone. Despite the first movie being an example of the Theseus paradox, where they replaced or left out so many parts of the original story that it's a completely new story, Sea of Monsters, for most of it at least, tried to follow the book as best as it could, given the fact that it was dealt a really bad hand by the previous movie, in that there were a lot of things that needed to be established that simply weren't. But the real problems for me with these movies were that aside from bastardizing the source material in a lot of cases, they were also shot, edited, and lit really boringly, the characters were painfully bland, the plot generally made no sense for a number of reasons, Luke was a really bad villain who was a complete idiot, most of the key elements of both the movies felt really half-baked and poorly established, everything felt kind of safe, the characters had the consistency of a bipolar shapeshifter. I could go on, but basically I feel as though they were just generally poorly made movies, even beyond the elephant in the room. And the fact that they clearly had no respect for the source material only painted a spotlight on the rest of the issues. But when it comes to the TV show, I found I was putting myself in the writer's room quite a bit mentally. Now, my background is mostly in live production, but some of you may know I have worked on some smaller independent films in the past, and I feel every critic should be in the writer's room at some point in their lives because it's an eye-opening experience. It's an entire room of people pitching ideas of how we can get from point A to point B in the most logical, succinct, and compelling way possible, while also bringing forth the tone of the work as best and as often as we can. When it comes to an adaptive work, there are certain things that have to be changed for the medium, and this may vary from situation to situation, but ultimately it comes down to this. Between internal narration and character dialogue, the sky is the limit as far as how detailed you want to get with the writing in a book, and the visuals don't really matter as much. But in a TV show, you're very rarely going to have narration, and the dialogue needs to hold the viewer's attention. So you have to basically pare it down until you can't take anything else away. So it's a necessity that a lot of detail is going to get cut, and the details that are there have to be brought across with as little dialogue as possible, preferably through visuals alone if possible. So during the process of watching this TV show, I found myself asking, why did they do that? And more often than not, there's an easy explanation, such as with the very opening scene. The series opens up really exploring Percy's backstory and how he's found himself as somewhat of an outcast because of the way his demigod nature has manifested. Not in the book, but it brings across his backstory and therefore the context of his personality succinctly and logically. Or even later on in the same episode, when Percy's expelled for allegedly pushing Nancy Boba Fett into the fountain, because why would you want to spend potential minutes of episode time having Percy go through his school year after this moment and be expelled for something comparatively inconsequential when you have a good inciting incident right here? And it makes sense that the moment Percy starts coming into his powers, his protector Grover would want him to get home as soon as possible, and so Grover is the person to get him expelled, which also creates potentially good interpersonal conflict between Percy and Grover. Oh, hello, Rick. And that was kind of the same pattern for the series, looking at something, thinking about it critically, and realizing it made more sense for the show than if they followed the book to the word. I feel like more than anything, this series was not only a chance to adapt the book, but also to be sort of a do-over for Rick Riordan, who was heavily involved with the show's creation and probably realizes in hindsight after almost 20 years of being an author that his work has the potential to be better. Some people I've seen seemingly wanted a word-for-word recreation, and that's just asinine, because on one hand, that would assume that the Lightning Thief book is perfect when it's really not. It's well written and it's nostalgic, but it also has a lot of cracks that show up when you go back to it as an adult. And on the other hand, by reshuffling the board a bit, it gives the show the chance to still surprise you. What enjoyment is there in watching something where you already know every single detail? I think the most contentious issue right from the beginning was characters not looking like their book counterparts. And on one hand, it's not an unreasonable thing to take issue with, and if I knew 100% of people were being completely and utterly good faith about it, I could maybe see the point. The problem is, as usual, there's a lot of disingenuousness when talking about quote-unquote visual accuracy. And while I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who are good faith about it, there's a sizable portion of people who have for a very long time been using the concept of visual accuracy as a thinly veiled excuse to do and say some very horrible things, like Mass Report Leah Jeffrey's Instagram account. In theory, if you're changing the appearance of a character, it should be for a good reason, such as the actor simply nailing the role better than anyone else. But needing a good reason is also a slippery slope, because where do we draw the line? Walker doesn't look much like how Percy was described as in the books. How good is good enough? How many physical characteristics are too many to change? Especially if it's really hard to find actors that look the part and are good. That's why I say sod the whole business, and unless the character's appearance is vital to their characterization and personality, I say pick the actor who best embodies the personality of the characters. And to be clear, for example, just because Annabeth's appearance was specified in the books, that doesn't automatically make it a vital part of her character. Because if you take away any mention of how she looks, nothing about her character would change. It's all about personality, and since we're on the topic, as far as personality, I think Leah Jeffreys did a good job at capturing Annabeth's personality.
Can I ask a dumb question?
It's like you need me to make fun of you.
I found her attitude was good. She carries that element of being obviously smarter than everyone else and is not afraid to talk down to people who she deems inferior to herself, both sarcastically and seriously, but also she portrays the ego and crippling hubris of Annabeth quite well. Plus, they also play into the fact that she's been at camp since she was 7 and so has no concept for the world outside of camp, which leads to some good humor and character moments.
I haven't seen a lot of horror movies, but this seems like exactly the kind of place they suggest to avoid.
I've never seen any kind of movie. I'll have to take your word for it.
She carries that performance well, but I found that she did come across as a bit mushmouth at times, so I think she should work on vocally emoting while also enunciating, but she'll grow into it. She's already doing a good job, and she's still so young. Aryan Samhadri is probably the weakest of the three. He's fairly monotone in his performance. He has his moments, but he's definitely noticeably less skilled than the other two.
You know what's interesting about this particular Seder path is it's actually the one my Uncle Ferdinand took when he set out on his own quest.
Meanwhile, Walker whatever, is a friggin' prodigy. I don't know where they dug this kid up from, but he just nails everything. He captures the dramatic elements of the character, but also radiates the perfect amount of goofball energy.
Wonder if she's around.
Be right down, just going to the potty.
He excels in near enough every aspect throughout the entire series, and as for the rest of the cast, I think they all pretty much nail it as well. Jason Mantzoukas as Dionysus is a match made in Olympus. If you know anything about Jason Mantzoukas, I don't even need to qualify that statement.
Mr. D is not your father.
I could be.
Yes, but are you?
Why must you ruin
everything.
Glyn Turman as Chiron is great. He carries a certain amount of regality that makes him come across as so much older than he looks. Lance Reddick as Zeus is something that I didn't know I needed, and now that Lance Reddick is no longer with us, it pains me that we'll never get to see more of this because he is fantastic. But my personal favorite is Adam Copeland as Ares, and I can't wait to talk more about that. The first 2 episodes were arguably the weakest in the series because they were trying to go through so much of the story in such a short amount of time. And even while most of the stuff they truncated does make sense, it still felt too fast-paced for its own good. Very few of the scenes got to breathe. You didn't really get to see that connection between Chiron and Percy that made Percy feel so betrayed when Chiron told him that Yancey Academy isn't for him. I didn't get an immediate understanding of Grover and Percy's relationship. I didn't get a feel for the rivalry between Clarice and Percy. You know, all little but nonetheless important things that could have used more time. That's not to say these episodes don't have their quality. They absolutely do. I think the way they portrayed Sally as an unconditionally loving mother is great, especially with her knowing that she has to let go of Percy very soon and has to explain the whole thing to him. It's pretty heartbreaking. And Virginia Call carries these dialogue-heavy scenes with so much palpable emotion.
Because he wasn't a man at all, he was a god.
Sally is also a much more active character in the story than you might expect. She doesn't sit back and let things happen to her. She's a decision maker. She takes action, especially if it concerns Percy's safety, but despite that, she still has all the same loving qualities as the character from the book. Then I love the fact that they gave Luke so much more screen time than he had in the book by giving him the role that Annabeth had by showing Percy around camp and introducing him to all the activities, because it has a dual purpose of giving us more time to get to know Luke so that the inevitable betrayal hit harder, and makes Annabeth more enigmatic and more cut off so that when her and Percy eventually do find themselves becoming friends, it means more. And that absolutely works. What I like about the portrayal of Luke is how detached he comes across, like he's suffered so much that he has a bit of a 1,000-yard stare about him, and the way he takes Percy under his wing and genuinely cares about him is very compelling.
I heard what happened to you on the hill, and I just wanted to say I'm really sorry.
I love the instant older brother, younger brother chemistry that Luke and Percy have, and it's not an act either. As we see later, he didn't want to betray anyone, he just wants a better world, and there's an inescapable clash between the beliefs and philosophy of him and his friends. Another thing from these episodes that I love is Percy's trauma from losing his mother, ostensibly. It may seem like he got over it quickly, but he really didn't. Instead of simply getting over it, he is shell-shocked and is projecting his trauma onto his father for not only allowing Sally to die, but also for neglecting both of them, for abandoning them, for allowing everything bad in his life to happen. So suddenly he has a chip on his shoulder and wants to do everything he can to force his father to take notice.
And people think I'm a big deal.
Well, sorta, but...
And my dad's got no choice but to claim me.
He's not depressed in a traditional sense, he's angry. He is focused. It's really compelling, and as a matter of fact, this is also consistent with the fact that he initially refuses the quest to rescue the lightning bolt because he believes he doesn't owe his father anything, but then the moment the prospect of saving Sally comes up, he immediately jumps on the opportunity. He's not doing this for his dad at this point, he's doing it exclusively for his mother. Plus, that scene where he tries to sacrifice some blue candy that his mother gave him just for the potential idea that she might be able to hear him in the afterlife is such a heartbreaking scene. If that's not grief, I don't know what is. And like I said, Walker nails that immensely.
I mean, ignoring me is one thing, but he doesn't get to ignore you.
Possibly my favorite part of either of these episodes is the context behind the Capture the Flag game. In the book, Annabeth uses Percy as bait for the Capture the Flag game to draw Clarice and her goons out because Clarice is angry about the toilet incident. But it's established here that Annabeth has been told that there will be a powerful demigod that will show up at camp one day who is destined to bring her on a quest. And she wants to see if Percy is that guy. So winning the Capture the Flag game is secondary to testing Percy on Clarice. Hence why she walks off with him, stations him in an obscure corner of the battlefield, and goes invisible with her enchanted Yankees cap to observe him. She doesn't care about the Capture the Flag game or Percy's well-being, she just wants to know if Percy's the one. And I think that really captures the spirit of Annabeth, capped off with a fantastic moment where she pushes Percy into the lake because she has a hunch about who his father is. Then there's a subtle detail that had to be pointed out to me that I really like, how instead of Percy being powerful in water, he becomes more powerful the closer he gets to water. Which is why he starts to take over on Clarice's crew when they're attacking him the closer he gets to the lake until he's on the lakefront and manages to defeat them. Actually, is that a lake or is that the ocean? Either way, great subtle storytelling there. One thing I didn't like at first, but works in hindsight, is Smelly Gabe being more of an antagonistic stepfather instead of being outright abusive. He's a giant loser who occasionally steps over the line, so he's been toned down, but so too is how we're supposed to feel about him, which works for the story they're telling. So yeah, there's a lot to like about the first 2 episodes, but the pace really lets it down. All these aspects were great, but they could have been better with more time to breathe. These episodes could have used an extra 10 minutes or so apiece. But after that, I feel the next 3 episodes get sequentially better. Episode 3 concerns Medusa. They get attacked by 2 of the Furies and get pursued all the way to Auntie M's, which builds into something that will only get better in the next episode. One of the major changes is that Annabeth is able to immediately suss out who Auntie M is, but then also Medusa doesn't make any bones about revealing her identity to the kids because she's a wolf in sheep's clothing. She's trying to gain their trust in order to get her own way, and she couldn't do that unless she sprinkled in a few truths among her many lies. First and foremost, her identity, and she seems perfectly reasonable, but of course a liar would if they're trying to manipulate you. It's a very good dialogue-focused episode that helps to bring across the personalities and the dynamic between the characters, but one thing you'll quickly notice becoming a pattern by this point, most of the action scenes in this series are not necessarily bad, but they're too short to either be good or bad. I can understand they're saving most of their budget for the big scenes, hence why some of the CGI is so shaky, but I will admit that in a modern age we're spoiled by action movies with never-ending action scenes, so we're surprised when somebody decides to deal with a problem quickly, but it still is kind of shocking to see some of these creatures go down with so little fight. Although using Medusa's head on Alecto, brilliant character work, bringing across their resourcefulness and cleverness, which also ties in 2 otherwise disconnected stories into each other brilliantly. Episode 4 is where I really start to notice what exactly it is that they're doing with the story as established. Because a book is an ongoing story, you can have several micro-stories on the way to the big climax. However, when you're dealing with a TV show, one of the things you can't avoid is the fact that every episode needs an inciting incident, rising action, climax, and so on. You can't really do that when you have a lot of independent micro-stories, so what they instead do is they reshuffle the jigsaw puzzle that is the story in order to tie in a lot of different smaller stories into one big episodic story, sometimes even including flashbacks to Percy's childhood that tie into the episode thematically. Episode 3 started this, but episode 4 is potentially the best example. In the book, they go to St. Louis for no real reason, and they encounter the mother of all monsters, Echidna, as well as a chimera on the St. Louis Arch. However, in the story, they instead encounter the chimera while on the train passing through St. Louis, but the conflict forces them to bail out and run for safety. And as it turns out, a lot of modern monuments are designed by demigods as secret tributes and temples to the gods, so the St. Louis Arch is actually a temple to Athena, and therefore is a sanctuary. However, in the previous episode, Percy mailed the head of Medusa to Olympus, which angered Athena, so now Athena is turning the other cheek and allowing the Chimera and Echidna to walk into the temple unopposed, which is literally foreshadowed in the previous episode when Medusa is telling Annabeth that Athena will betray her for something that someone else did.
But then Athena declared that I had embarrassed her and I needed to be punished. Not him. Me.
I mean, for most of the season, you get the impression that the gods are a bunch of dicks with a few exceptions, and this is the apex of that. So now Percy finds himself at the top of the St. Louis Arch alone with the mother of all monsters and a chimera. And that's not all. During the original encounter with Echidna, he was poisoned, and so that's been slowly eating away at him, coming to a head right here. Also, for what it's worth, I heard that the way they made Walker look sickly is by not putting any makeup on him, which I sympathize with. I also have bags the size of Mount Vesuvius. It's brilliant the way they're able to tie all these separate pieces together and even foreshadow them. Then they use even the most inconsequential details to further the characters both on screen and off screen. It's all a series of changes to the overall narrative that fits the episodic structure and makes the overall story so much more compelling by tying in so many different micro stories into one big story. This is the episode that really showed me that they knew exactly what they were doing. They earned the benefit of the doubt from this point forward. I didn't even mind the incredibly short fight with the Chimera because it showcases just how far out of his depth that Percy is. And the entire episode being bookended by the flashbacks to the mother-son swimming lessons and Percy learning that he can breathe underwater with the soundbite of his mother telling him to just breathe. Just breathe. Oh, chef's kiss. Also, I'd be remiss not to show this.
So we're just killing time till we find out that guy's like a werewolf or something, right?
The train is arriving at St. Louis.
Apparently that guy was a werewolf in the 2018 Sabrina series, so that's a nice Easter egg. Thank you to Simba for pointing that out. Episode 4 wasn't my favorite episode, but goddamn if it didn't sell me on the series. The distinction of being my favorite episode goes to episode 5, featuring the aforementioned Adam Copeland as Ares, where they have to steal back his shield from an abandoned amusement park. Some of you may know that I've been an on-again, off-again wrestling fan for most of my life, but I've always been a big fan of Adam Copeland, aka Edge, though still not a big enough fan to watch AEW for him. The dude has always excelled in everything he's done, so I was immediately pumped to see him cast, and dear God, he steals every scene he's in.
Then my dad made him puke them back up, then chopped him into a million pieces and chucked him into a bottomless pit, so that kind of set the tone right out of the gate.
If you're familiar, you'll definitely see a bit of Judgment Day era Edge in his performance. The slimy, sniveling, sinister Edge, the barely controlled rage, the fantastic facial expressions. It's all there, and going back to the era of edging Christian, or as my speech-to-text function thought I said, edging Christian, we all know that he's funny as well, and that's definitely apparent.
Give me a second, I'm just starting to fight on Twitter here. Nothing makes me happier than a good old-fashioned burn-it-down fight.
The idea that Ares is so fond of petty conflict that he starts Twitter arguments for fun is too good. Now, a point of contention was the Thrill Rido love sequence, because altogether now, it was different from the books. Most notably how there's no mechanical spiders or live TV broadcast straight to Olympus TV. But in hindsight, if this were a trap made by Hephaestus for Aphrodite and Ares, having spiders would make no sense because what connection does that have to any of their histories? Spiders are an Athena thing. All it showed is that Annabeth is petrified of spiders, which would come across as a bit contrived in hindsight when you could just establish that in a throwaway line as they did. And as for the lack of a TV broadcast, if I'm being honest, I feel like this show really cut out a lot of the more ridiculous elements from the book. Though for some reason, they still included the tighty-whities on the Minotaur in the first episode, but that's pretty much the only example. And I feel as though these elements were removed because they were attempting to have a more serious, grounded tone, and having a bunch of live broadcasts straight to Olympus TV would probably be a bit absurd, so I'm okay with that. Instead, what they did was they tied Hephaestus' own history in. The shield would only be released if somebody sat down on the cursed throne, because in Greek mythology, as revenge for Hera throwing Hephaestus off Olympus as a baby, Hephaestus created a magical throne that would trap her forever. The only reason he let her go was because he was eventually convinced by Dionysus, who incidentally was the only god to treat Hephaestus like an actual person. So it makes much more sense that he would want to take revenge on Aphrodite and Ares by forcing them into a situation where one of them would have to be trapped in the chair to get the shield back. And despite being different from the books, this is one of my favorite scenes in the show for pure characterization. Because Percy is so determined to sacrifice himself for the good of the quest, and Annabeth is having none of it.
The Oracle chose you. The gods chose
Stop.
you.
It isn't about that.
What could it possibly be about if it isn't about that?
You're better at this than me.
This makes for some of the best dramatic dialogue in the series, further helped in the following scene when Hephaestus shows up and Annabeth breaks through to him by insisting that all these games that they play may be how the gods want to do things, but she wants to be different from the gods. And that appeals to Hephaestus' own desire to be different as well. Meanwhile, this is brilliantly juxtaposed against Grover manipulating Ares by appealing to his ego and trying to get information out of him, which also makes for some of the best dialogue in this series.
I like your mellower stuff. There's something cool about overwhelming force and a quick surrender.
These two scenes happening simultaneously are sublime. I was hanging on every word, and an underrated element of the episode is also the set design. The abandoned amusement park looked pretty eerie, and the way it opens up with that trap only gives it a creepy undertone where you're not sure what to expect, like a saw trap can pop up and take them at any time. So I was pumped up for the next episode, and as many of you may be aware, the next episode was taking place in the Lotus Hotel, which had so much potential. both as far as visuals and storytelling. The movie understood that. In hindsight, the only issue with the movie's rendition, in my opinion, is the fact that Percy needed help from his father to snap out of it, but it captured the party atmosphere perfectly. Meanwhile, the TV version is closer to the book aside from having more of a reason to go there because that's where Hermes is, but this accuracy is to its detriment in my opinion. This episode has its moments and it has some great dialogue, but it's just kind of boring. The idea that simply being in the Lotus Hotel was making them forget doesn't really get played up all that much, and unlike the thing where Annabeth is immediately able to suss out who Auntie M is, them being able to immediately suss out what the Lotus Hotel was is kind of lame. It would have been fine if Hermes was the one who told them, considering they're going to the Lotus Hotel to find him anyway. So they had an out. People complained that the gang was too perceptive in this series, and I'm fine with them being able to figure out things on their own without pages of exposition, but this is one case where I think that whole thing went too far. Plus, Annabeth and Percy don't forget much because they stuck together, and so Grover was the only one who really forgot anything, and since they just find him, there was no tension to that, making the whole story context of the Lotus Hotel come across as one giant wasted opportunity, especially visually, because the casino was described as otherworldly in the book, and this just looks like a standard casino. I mean, it looked pretty cool from the outside, but the inside just looks kinda boring. So this is one case where I actually think the movie did it better. In some ways. This sequence was pretty good for character development, but fell flat in pretty much every other way, although stealing Hermes' car and using that to get to Santa Monica, good stuff. Who knew that simply driving out of a parkade could be so tense and funny?
That guy didn't even slow down.
Which reminds me, apparently parkade isn't a commonly used term. I didn't know that. The real major change that kept me intrigued, though, comes when they get to Santa Monica via Hephaestus' instant transportation car, and find that the summer solstice has come and gone, meaning that they missed their deadline, the quest is over, and war is inevitable.
Whoops.
This is one of those changes that I was a bit iffy about at first, but I decided I was taking a wait-and-see approach, and I'm glad I did because the payoff is stupendous. Even in the immediate aftermath, it makes things more tense because now they're dealing with a much more dire time crunch, really increasing tension, and it's great for characterization that they still choose to see the quest through even though they've technically failed. And now their time limit relies on how long it takes for the first battle to start. Also, I like that they're given 4 pearls and then lose one, because it shows that Poseidon planned ahead and genuinely cares. The fact that he only gave them 3 in the book is kind of a plot hole. Now, as for the next episode, they once again truncated some story elements for the better. I always thought that the Procrustes story in the book could have been cut and it wouldn't have been felt. But instead, they decide to put the door to the underworld in the back of his shop and turn this scene into a comedy scene. And that worked out really well. Once again, they already knew who he was as soon as they went to the shop, but if they knew the door to the underworld was in the back, they probably could have put a few pieces together, so I don't mind that. I was nervous about this episode because apparently a lot of people were dissatisfied with it, and it took me a few days to find time to watch it, but I thought it was genuinely up to that point, possibly the best episode yet aside from episode 5. Visually, this episode is on point. The underworld looks fantastic, and the set design is great both as far as visual and practical effects are concerned. And it's great that they made the underworld look dreary but not like a hellscape. Hades is not hell, and I'm glad they understood that. Then not only do I think they told the story of traveling the underworld really well, but they also told the story of the underworld itself really well. Passing through Asphodel, seeing all the souls rooted to the ground by their regrets, only for Annabeth to find herself rooted to the ground, forcing everyone to separate, setting up stories for later, that was pretty good. The moment where Grover was almost pulled into Tartarus was well done. Then there's the great through line of Cerberus following them, which kept the tension high. Charon not giving them the time of day was good. Those heartbreaking flashbacks to when Sally was trying to enroll Percy at Yancey Academy was compelling as hell, which itself I could probably dive into for 10 minutes. Everything was on point, and I found myself thoroughly riveted by the exchange with Hades, with both Percy and Hades gradually piecing things together. I can't even begin to go over all the individual moments and lines that I loved about this scene.
Kronos is in a million pieces at the bottom of Tartarus.
Where something just tried to pull us into it the moment the bolt appeared in our bag.
I was hanging on every word, but I will say I also enjoy the fact that they made Hades genuinely likable, because he's traditionally the most reasonable Olympian. He's immensely welcoming and doesn't antagonize the kids. He has sort of an energy that's hard to describe. It's like if Luke from Spy Kids was your favorite uncle, and instead of being evil, he became an interior decorator. And then there's the part where they realize what's happening, and Hades offers them sanctuary in exchange for the lightning bolt so he can protect them and himself from Kronos. That would make sense for why a seemingly reasonable god would suddenly want the lightning bolt that he didn't want before. Seriously, I was gripped this entire episode, and I genuinely don't know what other people were watching if they didn't like it. By the time the episode was over, I was chomping at the bit to see what comes next, and that brings us to the season finale, and I'm not gonna say it didn't disappoint. It disappointed just the tiniest bit for me. I feel like it fell short of the previous episode, but it was still a great episode in its own right. First of all, the Pearls took them back to Montauk instead of Santa Monica, which makes sense if the Pearls were meant to rescue Sally. Poseidon would obviously want them to take her back home, and it skips over one of the more notable plot holes in the book in that they built up for the entire book that Percy couldn't fly because Zeus would shoot him out of the air, and then Percy flies back to New York without a hitch. But either way, the episode begins with the fight between Percy and Ares, who incidentally was the real villain all along, interspersed with footage of Luke training Percy. They went for book accuracy more than anything here, and as such, the fight only lasts like 60 seconds, and I would have liked them to go a bit longer, but with that said, you can't really have it go too long because Percy's obviously so far out of his depth that if he tanks too many hits from Ares, it breaks suspension of disbelief. So I think they drew the fight out pretty much as long as they could, so I felt slightly underwhelmed, but that's once again probably down to modern action films making short, concise action kind of an alien concept in today's day and age. And hey, I'm the one who kept referring to the final fight in the first movie as an overblown CGI boss fight, and in a lot of cases, the action should be complemented by the characters and not the other way around. And I think that's something that the series does. Even though the action is somewhat low-key, I still care about all involved. Plus, for what it's worth, this fight is really good for as short as it is, ending with a spectacular set piece. Then the rest of the episode is pretty stellar. We finally see our first shot of Olympus, and it's just as otherworldly as I was hoping for. Although it's so big, Percy probably had to hike for like 3 days just to get to Zeus's throne, and this makes me so sad that we're never gonna see more Lance Reddick as Zeus because he nails that pompousness, arrogance, and egotism that you need to play Zeus.
The war proceeds. It ends with victory. You escape with your life. That is your prize.
The way he brushes off Percy's warnings and is still determined to go to war with Poseidon and decides on a whim to kill Percy for what he perceives as insolence, only for Poseidon to surrender the entire war that Zeus is determined to fight, all to save Percy? Chef's kiss. That right there made the decision to have the deadline pass worth it and then some. To me, this is the definitive payoff for the storyline. Everything just hits properly. The character acting in this scene is stupendous, and I can't fault anything about it. I can't possibly do it justice. You'd have to see the series for yourself. Then finally, we get to this interpretation of Luke's betrayal, and you know what I like about this interpretation of Luke? It's that he's genuinely not a fake person. He believes in what Kronos tells him, but he doesn't want to harm Percy. He wants Percy to join, and they only fight reluctantly when there's no other path. Plus, what sets him off is Percy mentioning Hermes. So Luke's father is genuinely a trigger for Luke, which is very intriguing. I feel like this interpretation sets the stage for a much more tragic arc for Luke. And I can't wait to see it. The rest of the episode is somewhat standard fare, winding down the action and tying up loose ends. Including Gabe, and I guess while Gabe wasn't as unlikable as he could be, this is where you realize they made him a gag character instead of an abusive husband. Probably because Sally willingly murdering a guy, as satisfying as it could be, had some unhealthy connotations to it. So instead he accidentally turns himself into a stone statue by opening up a package marked for Percy. So in hindsight, for this interpretation of the character, they made Gabe as unlikable as he needed to be. I mean, hey, he still got on live TV and vouched for Percy being a criminal. Though that brings me to the one loose thread that I don't recall being tied up. Is Percy not still a fugitive? In the book, the mist twisted everyone's perception so that the world believes that Ares kidnapped him, so in the book, everything that Percy did was retaliation, you know, trying to get people's attention. Which was a fine resolution, but that kinda got left on the cutting room floor here, which I think is the only major flaw with the final episode, because otherwise it's pretty damn good. What the series lacks in set pieces, it makes up for in character drama. I would assume that the budget wasn't the highest for this season, seeing as it was the first season and they had no idea if it would be popular, so I feel like later seasons will probably have a much grander scale, but for what this season was, I was perfectly satisfied. It hit every note that I wanted it to. The characters were good, the story was well told and well presented, despite being far from perfect. All the flaws that I could bring up are mostly nitpicks. It's easy to get caught up in nitpicks, but as long as the show as a whole is enjoyable, then I don't mind. Almost every single change made sense, making the story more cohesive, more climactic, and more grounded where it needed to be. While I can probably CinemaSins the hell out of it, the ability to nitpick does not make a show good or bad. What matters is, was it compelling? Did it hold my interest? Did I like the characters? Did I find the drama engaging? And the answer to all of this is yes. I think that once it gets past its growing pains, this is a good show that has the potential to be a great show. And I feel like seeing the response by some of the fans has been kind of baffling, honestly. Now, I've talked to 3 other people who watched the show, 1 person who's never read a Percy Jackson book, and 2 people who've read them at some point in their lives, and then there's me, who listened to the audiobooks as late as last year. And all of us have enjoyed the show, so I see some of the weird extreme reactions that the show is getting in some spheres, and I question if we're even watching the same show. Now, there's no doubt that opinions will vary, but I swear some people are treating it like the Antichrist, and I'm not gonna lie, it seems like some of the extreme reactions to this are so hyperbolic that it's almost comical. There's definitely a degree of people who were nostalgic for the movies, or people who are just generally anti-modern media, and therefore may pretend that they were giving the show a chance, but were actively going into it expecting to and maybe even wanting to dislike it. I've seen this with my own eyes, and I just don't get it. If you know you're not going to like something, why would you watch it to begin with, let alone continue to watch it after you've already decided your opinion? Especially if that opinion is based on accuracy. Not accuracy, accuracy. Basically, if you gave the show a chance and just didn't like it, fair enough. But if you genuinely went into it expecting to hate it, but still watched the whole thing just to have a big cathartic moan, then your opinion is disingenuous and should be discarded. That's something I've seen enough of, though I won't give any specific examples because some people don't deserve the oxygen of publicity. I don't know, I find the discourse surrounding all modern media to be so exhausting because it comes across like so many people have decided that anything made after 2015 is inherently evil, so they actively spend their days looking for reasons to dislike things. Then it just becomes a recurring self-fulfilling prophecy. And this gets me into a larger discussion that's too big for this video, so I should probably wrap this up. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, exclusive content, and more, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Gaw004, My Name is Tank, Monsieur Thenardier, Patchwork, Raaf, and WeirdWebbster for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.